Hey everyone, this is the population ecology lecture. Okay, um, all right. So, what are the goals for this particular presentation, or what is it that we want to take away overall going into our fourth and final exam? Two things. For one, we want to understand how populations fluctuate in numbers over time. In that conversation, we'll also talk about um, things like how do we record densities and dispersion patterns? Uh, what kind of trends do we see overall in natural populations in terms of growth? And the second thing we want to look at are resources, because populations are affected by things like resources. So at some point, we need to look at um, what kind of resources are out there for populations, and specifically in the case of humans, how are we managing those resources to sustain um, our massive population that's still growing? All right, so ultimately, what I'm suggesting is that as we go through these lectures, you want to keep in mind the human population, and sort of like as we cover growth trends and things like birth rates, death rates, migration patterns, immigration, emigration, you want to keep thinking and reflecting on the human population, because we're so distinct and unique from the animal world, but still, you know, a part of the biological world. So we do fit in um, to some of these trends, but also in interesting ways, especially as it relates to what sorts of things do we do for resource management. All right, so I like to begin the discussion on population ecology by reflecting on a population of Polynesians that landed on Easter Island sometime in AD 1000 to AD 1200. And as you might suspect, they landed on this island and it was uninhabited. And there were an enormous amount of resources by way of uh, lumber, or at least as close to lumber as you can get, like with things like palm trees. And also potential food sources, um, some of which they brought themselves, by the way. But if you look at the images of what Easter Island kind of looks like now, you'll see that it's largely grasses and these very elegant stones, right, erected, oftentimes staring off into the ocean, and they were also colored. And you might understand that it took a lot of people power to move them around. And we think that they also used things like palm trees to roll them to their positions, and also to then, stand them up. So how do we know that there were all these palm trees there now that, all we see is grasses? When digging through soil and sifting it, we find evidence of seeds of what existed there a long time ago, and so that's how we know about those trees and other vegetation. But we also see evidence of the sorts of species that might have gone extinct. Um, to cut to the chase, the people of Easter Island overconsumed their resources, and they did not plan well for potential overpopulation. And so, in overconsuming, eventually they turned on themselves, they warred with each other. There's evidence of some cannibalism, and then ultimately, the population crashed. The few survivors were then enslaved by the Europeans that showed up. All right, so I like to start out this way because it's sort of like a cautionary story or cautionary tale of what could potentially happen to us on a global scale. And I think we're seeing some geopolitical challenges by way of migration patterns and also the inequity in our resources on a global scale. Another reason to think about populations is maybe what's happening around your home. I like gophers. I like a really nice lawn. I just don't like them together. I don't like gophers digging through my nice lawn. And so there's a variety of things that people use as strategies to try and contain the gopher population. My mom likes to stick a hose in there and just tries to drown them. Even though I've explained to her that the gopher tunneling system is very elaborate, there are levels of these tunnels. The highest levels is where they store their food. The low levels are basically where the water will end up, and you're just not going to drown them. You're just not. You're going to waste your water, and in California, that's a big deal. Some people put poison down in there, but that could potentially affect unintentionally some other animals, birds, cats in the neighborhood, and so on. And still others use traps, right? So I think that if the goal is to reduce your gopher population, you would do all of those things, right? They compound each other's effects. But one thing that works really, really well is to basically cut off the food supply to the gopher. So the gopher is digging up these mounds because they're chasing after grubs. These are the larval stage of beetles, and it's a good, rich protein source. So one thing you could do is you could just spray an insecticide over the lawn, and then that'll limit the grub population of larvae that attract the gophers, and so they won't come to your lawn, and you'll be doing better than all of the other poisons that come with issues. Aphids on the right-hand side can also be contained biologically with ladybugs, and you can buy these at local nurseries or some big chain home improvement places that I won't name here. All right, so let's begin our discussion of populations now that we understand both a global phenomenon that gives us reason to learn about populations, and also if you choose to sort of shy away from the big global challenges facing us all, maybe a more pragmatic reason to understand populations is, what is your circumstance at home with your own pests. So populations are defined as groups of individuals of a single species that occupy the same area, and then we add same time. So there's three sames: species, area, and time. And because they're members of the same species, they rely on the same resources, whether that's food, shelter, right? It's the same resources. They're also in the same area, so they're influenced by the same environmental factors. And because they're there at the same exact time, they're going to interact with each other. And that could be competition, that could be fights, that could be mates, or mate selections. All right, so that's a population. And when population ecologists study populations, they like to study their numbers, and they also like to study their distribution patterns. Those two things are key to understanding populations in the early investigations of those populations, right? And populations also interact with their environments, right? They can interact with other living things, and they can interact with things that are abiotic. This is non-living things. That could be interacting with the environment as an abiotic factor. Biotic factors would be living things. That could be other species, maybe what you're preying on, maybe what you're eating, maybe what's attacking you because you're the prey and someone else is a predator. Or, maybe making shelters or nests in trees. That's you interacting with other living things. Okay, so overall, the living and the non-living cause variations in population sizes. So we have to look at those as well. All right, so population ecology is concerned with the changes in population size. That's the big deal. And what are factors that regulate populations over time? And that's especially important to biologists that manage, say, state parks or more elegantly, national parks. Like Joshua Tree has biologists that specialize and assist in monitoring populations of a variety of species in Joshua Tree, a really, really cool national park, and it's the closest national park to us at Moreno Valley College. All right, how do populations increase over time? Generally speaking, how do they increase? Well, normally it's through birth rates and through immigration. If your birth rates are higher than your death rates, then there's more individuals being added to the population by way of birth. And you add to that the number of individuals that are coming into the population as opposed to people that are leaving it. So populations tend to grow by way of birth and immigration. And not surprisingly, they are reduced in size by way of death and emigration. That's individuals leaving the population or the area. So when we look at the number of individuals in an area, that's called population density. If you have 10 individuals in an acre, then you have 10 per acre. If you have 20 individuals in an acre, you have 20 per acre. So we're not just counting, do you have 10 or do you have 20? We're asking, you have 10 or 20 and how much space? So when we ask for that, normally it's the area, right? This is the area on the ground. But sometimes we have to look at volume. That's if you are digging through the soil to look down into the soil. In that case, that's going to be volume. So this is area, length times width. But volume would be length times width times height. That's volume. So this is area. That's volume. So depending on the species, the density could be area, individual oak trees in an area. Oak trees are not underground, they're all above ground, so that's an easy one, area. But if, again, you're going to look at earthworms, then that's going to be volume. So here's a cubic meter. So that would be like 1 meter in length, 1 meter across, and 1 meter deep. That's 1 meter cubed. A meter, 3 ways. But area is just length times width. That could be like an acre, could be an area. All right, so those are population densities. We can also look at populations in aquatic systems as well. But those are, as I think you can understand, a little bit trickier. Measuring schools of fish, that's a challenge. Measuring groups of dolphins, or what we call pods, is surprisingly easier because we take aerial pictures of them, helicopters flying over bodies of water, the ocean. And if you take images of the dorsal fins of the dolphins, the dorsal fin acts like a fingerprint. And so you can figure out how many different dorsal fins you have, and that's how many different dolphins you have, and there you go. That's how many dolphins per pod. All right, so the idea here is that a population ecologist knows their population species really well, and so they know what is the best way to determine density. Okay, another aspect of studying populations early on is, by early on I mean like when you're first starting to look at a population in an area. Another aspect would be dispersion patterns. Like how are they organized in that area, right? So they can be clumped, they could be uniform, or they could be random. And we can go through each one of these. The clump pattern is very common whenever the resources are unequally distributed. On exam 4, if I tell you that a species of whatever animal is growing on unequally distributed food sources, then you should pick a clumped pattern of distribution for that animal species. If their food supply is clumped, then the thing that is eating that food is also going to be clumped. And that's individuals grouped in patches for simplicity. So in this case, the sea stars are clumped. You'll have areas with a lot of them, areas with few of them, areas with a lot, but normally in some sort of patchy distribution. Doesn't matter the numbers in each little patch, right? They're all kind of patches anyway. And the same is true about like the sea anemones that you're seeing above the sea stars. These guys right here are sea anemones. They're also clumped. The resource in this case isn't food. The resource in this case is like water and usually some sort of like shelter. They especially need the water, and if they can be covered, then they're also protected from the sun, and that's beneficial to them also. In fact, if you look at some of these sea anemones up close, you'll see that they have these little shell fragments on them. Sea anemones often use shell fragments to cover themselves and give themselves a little protection from the sun. It's sort of like sun shielding. It's very cool if you ever see them out in tide pools here in California. Okay, a uniform pattern is found among individuals that are interacting with each other, normally like interacting in such a way that they're sort of territorial, so they equally space themselves out. Here's a human population showing you that even distribution pattern, right? People are respectful of the space of other people, for the most part. The random pattern is often seen whenever a population is spaced in an unpredictable way. And plants are notorious for spreading themselves out unpredictably. So if you're asked about how plants are distributed, I think you're going to say unpredictably. All right. This part of the lecture should sound familiar because we covered it in lab as part of our last population ecology lab. So in this portion, we look at what are called life tables, where we track your ability to survive at various ages. So early on, what's your survival like when you're a baby? What's your survival like when you're an adolescent? What's your survival like when you're an adult? What's your survival like when you're more senior? So I'm not talking about humans necessarily, I'm talking about any animal. That's a life table. And if we graph the life table, then it becomes a survivorship curve. So life tables are basically the data that you put on a graph to make a survivorship curve. And there are three prominent ones. All right, so let's look at a table. This is from 2004, a US population. And we are starting with 100,000 individuals, ages 0 through 10. And all we're asking is, okay, of the 100,000 individuals, how many of those individuals actually made it to the next stage of their lifespan, 10 to 20? And then we'll ask, okay, of those that entered 10 to 20, how many of them actually made it to 20 and 30 years of age? All right, so let's go back to the 0 and 10. So we start out with 100,000 individuals here. And then notice that 871 of them died. So how many actually made it to the ages of 10 through 20? It's 99,129. So what is 99,129 out of 100,000? It's like 99.1% survival. So if a child is born right now, we can say, okay, look, your chances of making it to 10 to 20 is 99.1%. That's a pretty good percentage. Now, what about the age group 10 through 20? What are the chances of surviving that? Well, 419 individuals die. That's less than half died up above, right? Looks like less than half. Well, so what is the survivors are now 98,709. What percentage is that of this 99,129? Well, that's 99.6% survivability. So that's doing really well. Okay, and then of the 98,709 that started, 933 die. That's a lot. That's more than when we started this at 0 through 10. So we're dipping back to 99.1% survivability at that age of 20 through 30. And you would think that it should be better because you're 20 through 30. Like shouldn't you be doing better than 10 through 20, and certainly better than 0 through 10 when you have all these viral infections that you have to survive, and also that tax your immune system when it's still developing, and you need vaccines and all this junk. So shouldn't you survive better? Well, interestingly, the life tables are something that was originated by insurance agencies, not from the field of biology. We learned about them, and then we adopted them and applied them to biological populations. So what we know is that from studying the human population over and over again, these are the trends. This is the survivability at all different stages of our lives, right? So if we take a look down below, what are the chances of surviving 70 to 80 years of age? It's pretty good. It's really good. 70.1%, or 71%, I would round it. But when you get to 80, 90, it looks like, wow, we really decline, right? Okay, so if you were to take the age and call that the x-axis, and if you were to take the percentage and call that the y-axis, and then graphed it, you would see this. See, here's the x-axis, and then here is your percent survivors. And we start out 99, 99, 99, right? And then just like, boom, we drop down. When we get to like 80, 90, we're down to like 40% survivability. But this typifies large mammals. Large mammals tend to have long lifespans. They have few offspring. They invest a lot of parental care. Humans are a good example of that. Elephants are a good example of that. Rhinos, giraffes, right? Gorillas. Large mammals have long lifespans, few babies, invest a lot of parental care. On the other hand, smaller mammals, squirrels, rodents, rabbits, right? They have shorter lifespans. They have a litter or a clutch of eggs, a group of eggs. And their survivorship kind of starts high as babies, but then slowly declines all through every stage of their lives. It's a constant decline. So they have a litter, a clutch, shorter lifespan, and they invest some parental care early on. That's how you get that high survivorship. But slow and steady decline throughout their different age groups. And then finally, there's the type 3s. These are the invertebrates. These are organisms that don't have a spinal column, or spinal, or a spine. They have an explosion of offspring, tons of babies made, no parental care, and also the shortest lifespan. And we should understand that life exists all throughout there, all in the middle. Type 1, type 3, those are the perimeters, and anything goes in the middle. Okay, so we looked at a table and we graphed it for humans, and we came up with a type 1 survivorship curve. Okay, the next thing that you can look at in studying populations, aside from how many are there in an area or volume, how are they dispersed, and how well do they survive through different ages of their lifetime. Another thing you can study is overall, what is that population doing at the moment? in terms of growth. So this isn't survival. This is looking at what are you doing as a population in the moment. Are you growing fast? Are you not growing at all? Are you growing but growing slowly? Right? So there are two population growth models that we want to know. The first one is called the exponential growth model. It looks like this. Population is exploding. Population is growing super fast. It started out slow, but then picked up and then just kept going, and now it's like a massive population. And there's a formula for that kind of growth. That's the formula that we covered in lecture. Growth equals R times N, where R is the rate of growth. The rate of growth can be a positive value or it could be a negative value. And you can figure out the growth rate by taking the birth rate and subtracting from that the death rate. So if you had a birth rate of, say, 0.4 and a death rate of 0.3, 0.4 minus 0.3 would equal 0.1. So that would be R. That's the growth rate, 0.1. What does 0.1 mean? 0.1 is 10%. So if we're saying the birth rate is 40%, subtract from that 30%, then you should get 10% as your growth rate. 10% of what? 10% of whatever number of individuals you have in the population at the moment. That is N. So if you had 100 individuals and asked what is 10% of 100, that would be 10. So the formula would go like this. G equals a growth rate of 0.1 or 10% times 100 individuals. That gives you 10. So that means that you're going to grow by a value of 10 individuals. That's your growth. All it says is you're going to add 10 individuals to that population. But how many individuals did you start out with? Remember, you started out with 100, and then you're about to add 10 to it, so your new population number is 110. That's the new population number. But G itself, that was only 10. Remember, G is growth, not total. What if the birth rate were actually 0.3 and the death rate were 0.4? Well, in that case, you subtract negative 0.4 from 0.3. So you're going to be in the negative 0.1. That's R now. So if you make that negative, then that means that your population is declining by 10. So this would be a negative 10. Right? So if you had a negative there, negative 0.1 times 100, that's negative 10. So what is 100 minus 10? Well, now you're losing members of your population by 10. So you're down to 90. All right, so the whole purpose there is that you should understand that R's can be positive or they can be negative. All right, what does that population look like? This is, again, a exponential growth. Notice that you start off really slow and then all of a sudden you blow up as a population. And we're showing you examples of rabbits. Rabbits are good models for showing exponential growth. So are rats, mice, insects, right? Fast reproducers, or basically anything that's like a type 2 or a type 3 survivorship. They tend to grow exponentially whenever the resources are great, right? Why is that? Because they have the larger reproductive efforts, a litter, a clutch for type 2, or they have massive reproduction for type 3s. It's just more difficult for type 1s, which have few offspring. It's more difficult for them to grow super fast or to grow exponentially really quick. But they could do it over a long period of time because their lifespans are long. If they survive well and they just keep reproducing, then you can show exponential growth, but it takes much longer. It's not fast. Type 2 and 3, those are fast. They tend to show exponential growth right away. Type 1s take forever to show exponential. And shortly thereafter, they start leveling off anyway, as you're going to see in the next growth curve. Okay, so let's take a look at exponential growth in a table form. So again, here's your formula. G equals R times N. And notice that we start out with a 30% growth rate. And the N value is 20. So G equals 0.3 times 20. That's what's going to go in there. And when you do that math, you get a value of 6. So you grew by 6. So these are new individuals. But notice that those new individuals now get added to the original 20, and that's how we got 26. And that same 30% of 26 now gives you 8. Add 8 to 26, you now have 34. What's 30% of 34? Roughly 10. Add 10 to 34, now you got 44. And on it goes. Okay, so on the exam, you will be given R, you will be given N, and you have to do this formula or find the formula in the multiple choice that gives you the right answer. Another thing that you might see, another thing you will see, is if you're given the birth rate and you're given the death rate. If I give you those two, you should be able to figure out R, because we did that here. Birth rate minus death rate gives you R. So if I give you those, you should be able to tell me R. I'll give you the population size, the number. I'll give you N, and then you just do the math from there. Okay, the other graph is the logistic growth model. So that one looks exponential, but then it levels off. So that's what's called logistic. And it levels off because the population reaches something called K, and K stands for carrying capacity. And the carrying capacity is a simple concept. Any particular area only has so many resources, so it can only support a very specific amount of individuals of a species. So if we're looking at, say, a park in your neighborhood, that park might only be able to hold maybe, depending on the size of the park, let's say it's a small park, it might only be able to hold like 20 trees of a particular type. But it'll hold a whole lot more birds than 20. It'll support more earthworms and other insects. So the carrying capacity is specific to the species. In other words, if an area can only support 20 trees, that doesn't mean it can only support 20 of everything. 20 insects, 20 ants, 20 beetles, 20, I mean, it's not 20, right? You can support 20 trees, but you can support 2,000 ants. And that even that is kind of small. But you get what I'm saying. Like every species is going to be different. Okay, the formula for carrying capacity is right there. K minus N, you'll recognize N as the number of individuals in the population. K minus N divided by K. That'll give you the percentage of the carrying capacity that's available for you to grow. You will not be calculating that on the exam. The only thing you need to worry about on the exam is G equals R times N. That's simple enough. And you do need to know that a carrying capacity sets the limit, right? In an area, it lets you know just how many individuals you can put in that area. Okay, I hope that made sense. Here's what the logistic growth curve looks like. And also you should know that this one is on the exam. Put a star by it. All right, so in this case, we could ask you, in what year did the first seal population reach its carrying capacity? And it looks to me like it reached it right about here. So it looks to me like it's about 1940. We can also ask, okay, what is the carrying capacity? And it looks like it's over 9,000, somewhere between 9 and 10,000 breeding male fur seals. So it's 9 to 10,000. That's the carrying capacity. That's K. All right, but notice that it has like a little bit of an exponential rise and then it levels off. All right. So you can compare the two side by side. You can see the exponential curve and exponential, and then it levels off. All right, so at this point now, we can start focusing on resources. Okay, we see populations growing. Why do they level off? What's going on? Here's a table that shows the effect of reaching your carrying capacity. If the carrying capacity is set to 1,000 individuals, like that's how many you can support, and you started out with 100, then we have 90% of the carrying capacity left to grow. Remember, that's the percentage of the carrying capacity available. So you have 90% of it still available. What happens when you're at 500? Well, you got 50% available. What happens when you're at 700? Well, now you only have 30% available. And if you're at 1,000, okay, well, now you're at 0. You can't add anymore. You've reached your carrying capacity. And that's going to slow down how much a population grows. So why does it slow down its growth? Well, the density of the individuals in that area are now having an effect on them, usually leading to declining births or leading to an increase in deaths, or both. So we can look at one at a time. Here's an example of a bird species whose number of eggs from breeding pairs is declining as the number of breeding pairs increases. So when you have very few breeding pairs, you have 10 pairs or 20 birds, the females lay the eggs, and when you add up all the eggs, right, the 10 females are laying something like 12 eggs, right? And then here's an anomaly, like that must have been a lot of resources in that particular time. But here's an example now of 20, and notice that largely fewer eggs. 40, fewer eggs, right? So the more individuals you add to the population, the less eggs they're producing. So that's affecting their births. It's declining. And that makes sense, right? If you're a bird, you need calories to keep your own metabolism, your own energy levels up to stay alive. And you need extra calories if you're going to invest them into making an egg. That's a big deal. That's a lot of calories. And if the number of individuals in the area is growing, then there's fewer calories. And so there's less energy available to make eggs. Fewer births. Okay, so there's competition among individuals for resources, right? They can compete for food, and that limits the population growth. The food is one resource, but then there's also nutrients. So what are we saying here? Food is like for animals eating, right? Nutrients might be for like plants, and the nutrients in the soil, in other words. There could also be like limiting retreats for safety, like there's just not a lot of places to hide. Burrowing animals could be a good example. And there also might be limiting nesting sites on a tree. Birds generally like to nest at a particular height. Some birds like to nest up high, and some birds nest down low. They're all a little different. So on a tree, you can have more than one type of nest, one high, one low, and there's no competition, right? But if you have a bunch of birds trying to nest at the same level, same height of the tree, then you're going to be competing for that. Okay, so aside from births, there's also, or declining births, you can also have an increase in deaths. And that's what we're seeing here in this case. Here's a flower beetle, and notice that as the density of the beetle population increases, the percent survivability declines. So fewer survive. They could be in competition with each other, they could be stressing each other out, and it just leads to death. All right. Populations can also be affected by things that have nothing to do with their density. So we call that density independent factors. So this has nothing to do with your density. This is attributed to something outside of your population numbers. This could be fires, storms, habitat destruction, seasonal changes in weather like aphids are affected, right? All of these would be chance catastrophic events, and they um, sharply reduce populations. And it had nothing to do with their particular densities. Here's an example of an aphid population that is growing exponentially. And then all of a sudden there's a lot of deaths. And it has nothing to do with their population numbers. Instead, it has something to do with the fact that it's now the hot time of the summer. There's less water. Plants are not getting enough water, so they do less photosynthesis. Productivity declines. There's less food for the aphids, and more aphids begin to die, right? And so there's a higher death rate than there is a birth rate. So you decline in numbers, but it had nothing to do with your population. It had everything to do with an outside force, in this case, the weather, temperature. All right, some populations fluctuate on what's called a boom-bust cycle, meaning that you can have like, um, let's say a population of rabbits that is like doing this, and you're like, why are you doing that? And well, that's because there's a lynx population that's affecting those numbers, something like that. Um, so what exactly is happening in this case? Um, in this case, like if that's the rabbit population and this is the lynx population, a lynx is like a snow bobcat. So as the rabbit population increases, there's more food for the lynx, and that's why you're seeing the lynx responding to the growth of the rabbit population. Now the lynx is growing in numbers. But as the lynx grows in numbers, then that causes the rabbit population to decline, and shortly thereafter, not surprisingly, so does the lynx population. As the lynx population declines, the rabbit population now increases, and then so does the lynx. I think you get it. I think you understand that the lynx and the rabbit are oscillating up and down around each other's presence, right? And and it looks like this, and it's kind of like on a rhythmic time scale, right? Look at that. They're like so nicely balanced. They're about the same amount of years, right? So between here and here, it's 25 years, 25 years, 25 years, right? And then notice that within a 25-year span, there's 1, 2, 3 cycles. So that's like a um, 7, 8-year cycle. All right, so the big takeaway here is that now that we understand that, and we kind of know this intuitively, right? The lynx is dependent on the rabbit population for its own welfare, its own food supply. Um, to be clear, the bobcat isn't, or the lynx isn't the only thing eating the snowshoe hare. It's also eaten by owls and other raptors, other hawks. It's also eaten by foxes, by coyotes, right? Potentially also cougars. So there's a variety of things eating it. But you could create a up-down cycle between the snowshoe hare and any of these other ones. The lynx was just an easy one to record over time. And the other takeaway is that predators tend to rebound a lot slower. And so if you're managing a particular area, a park, a national park or a state park where there are these sorts of interactions, you want to make sure that you keep, in this case, the rabbit population at good numbers in order to keep the predator population healthy, because it takes them a lot longer to rebound. And that's because they're territorial, they're spread out over big spaces, right? So they're not like necessarily fast reproducers, right? They're kind of solitary creatures. I'm talking about the large cats. Okay, yet another thing that you can study in a population, aside from uh, density, dispersion patterns, survivorship curves, growth models, um, and how growth models are impacted by resources, which can then lead to low births, high deaths, or external factors that can also derail your growth model, or cyclical patterns where you can superimpose two different species on each other. Aside from all that, you can also study life histories. And life history traits, see, there's a genetic component. These traits are affected by evolution because traits are genetic, and genetics is all about alleles, and evolution affects allele percentages. So life history traits include age of first reproduction, frequency of reproduction, number of offspring, amount of parental care. All of those things taken together are genetically based and therefore are affected by evolution. So life histories are affected by evolution. It turns out that populations can be broken into two main categories. You can be R-selected or you can be K-selected. Individuals that have, or populations or species that have R-selected life histories produce more offspring and grow rapidly in unpredictable environments. So as an example, you could level a building or a home structure and leave it to just the dirt after removing everything, including the concrete pad that the structure was built on. And when you just leave dirt, it's not surprisingly to find immediately a ton of little weed-like plants are growing on it, making the field green. Those would be examples of our selected species that have many offspring and are growing in an unpredictable environment. So basically, anything that is a fast reproducer, cockroaches, mosquitoes, flies, oysters, clams, crustaceans, right? All of them are R-selected. They grow super fast, and they are built for unpredictable environments. You want to be a fast reproducer in an unpredictable environment, because when the conditions are right, you want to grow fast because it's so unpredictable. Conditions might be bad soon after. K-selected species, on the other hand, right, are the kind of species that grow slow. They have few offspring, and they tend to maintain relatively stable populations because the environment tends to be stable. So if you're picking up on what is R and what is K, you should recognize R, that's your growth rate. That's the R value. And K, that's the carrying capacity. So large kinds of mammals, they tend to be K-selected because they have few offspring and because they grow into their carrying capacity slowly, because they reproduce slowly. But some type 2s and type 3s especially, they grow so fast, their populations tend to crash. Again, because of the unpredictable environment they're in. So a lot of species can also fall somewhere in between. Like there's grades of R and grades of K. It's not just your R or your K and it's identical. Like, no, there's shades of R and there's shades of gray. Shades of K. All right. All right, so I'm going to cover this Trinidad and Tobago study, and then we'll cut this lecture here, and then we'll do a lecture on resources after this one. And that one's going to be interesting, and it'll go a lot quicker, I think. All right, so evolution can be shaped by your, or can shape your life histories, right? This is what we were saying earlier. So here's an example of that by way of a study done in Trinidad on a guppy population. So this is an island nation, Trinidad and Tobago. I think it's a two-island nation these days. And here's the way the study went. So first, there's a population of guppies in this pond right here, and there's a killifish that feeds on those guppies. This is the killifish right here. And the killifish likes to prey on small guppies. So what do guppies do? Well, they spend, their time being chased by the killifish when they're small. But later they become larger and the killifish now can't eat them because they're bigger. And the killifish prefers the smaller guppies anyway. So when you're large, that's when you reach sexual maturity. That's when you decide to reproduce. So as far as life history traits go for the small guppy, they like to reproduce later in age, right? And that is the strategy we're looking at right now. Okay, but then there's another pond, and that one has a different predator. This is the pike cichlid, and this guy likes to eat guppies that are smaller at sexual maturity. So that means that the guppies would rather be small at sexual maturity, whereas the guppies up here like to be large at sexual maturity. The pike cichlid can't catch the little ones, they're too fast. But when they get big, they're easier to catch. So what would happen if we swapped them? What would happen if we took guppies that were small at sexual maturity and we put them in there with a killifish that likes to eat small? So we're going to take these guys that like to reproduce when they're small, and we're going to take this guy and we're going to force them to live together. What happens then? If evolution is the reason why these guppies, two different populations, but members of the same species, right? If they are reproducing at different ages because that's the response, that's their adaptation evolutionarily, then we ought to be able to see it. So let's take the small guppies that the killifish likes to eat, and let's put them together. And so that's exactly what happened. Took the killifish and took the small guppies, and here's the results of that. What we found is that the males that were small started getting bigger at maturity. Females, which are already bigger than the males, you can see in the control groups, which is in blue, they also started getting bigger. So it looks like they were adapting to the new environment. Basically, a population of guppies that had like small at sexual maturity versus large at sexual maturity, right? They started shifting, showing directional selection, shifting towards being larger at sexual maturity. Their mass is greater, so they were getting bigger. And also their age was also increasing for sexual maturity. So when they reached sexual maturity, it was now later for males and later for females. So their mass was getting bigger, and so was their age. They were responding to a fish that likes to eat them when they're small. So they started responding by getting bigger. Okay, do you see how this could be interpreted as Lamarckism, right? But Lamarck said the individual changes in their lifetime, and that's not true. And also, this still looks like, well, aren't they responding to a challenge? They're not. The, the population has variation, and the challenge is exposing the fact that some individuals are still better at reproducing when they're older, and now there's more of those than there are of the others, the one that reproduce when they're smaller and younger. So this challenge exposes the fact that there's variance in the population, and those variants are doing better. So the population is adapting. This is natural selection. Okay, so what's going to happen in the next video is we're going to look at sustainable resource management, right? We're now going to focus our attention on human population, right? So we'll pick it up from here.